started. Hello everyone, welcome to this session on Does Capitalism Need Oppression? My name is Evan, I'm a member of the International Socialists of Hamilton and also a member of Keep 1281, and I will be chairing this session. First, I'll start with the land acknowledgement. So this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was subject of the District 1 Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place in Toronto is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community in this territory. So for this session, our speakers will be Failene, who's a member of the International Socialists in Toronto, and Anton, who's a member from Vancouver. They will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, after which time we will have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. And so I'll turn over to Failene to start us off.
Okay, so the title of the talk, if you were in the first session, the title of this talk is Does Capitalism Need Oppression? If you were in that session, it's pretty clear that capitalism certainly is about oppression. So that was a very moving session, and what we're doing in this session is a little bit different. We're trying to look at sort of what's a Marxist analysis of oppression, how do we get rid of oppression. So theoretically at least, it might seem like the answer to the question could be no, does capitalism need oppression? Because the driving impetus that underlies capitalism as a system is the need to accumulate and to create profits, as in Marx's famous description of the profit motive in volume 1 of Capital, where he says, accumulate, accumulate, this is Moses and the prophets. Exploitation, by which Marx meant the extraction of surplus value from the worker, is the process by which the system lives or dies. Surplus value, simply put, is the amount of money that the capitalist makes after the wages paid to the workers for their labor. The profit margin, which the capitalist must then plow back into production or development of technology and means of production in order to stay competitive with rival companies. Oppression, discrimination based on supposed shared characteristics of the oppressed group, may then seem like an add-on, an unnecessary appendage to the real agenda of the capitalist, which is the creation of profit. And in one sense, this is an accurate description of how the system might work in an ideal capitalist world, one devoid of real living human beings, where profits could be generated by non-differentiated robots who would simply accomplish their tasks, no questions asked. But of course, capitalism is a system that was created by human beings moving through history. The workers whom capitalism depends on for its profits also have the potential to be the system's downfall, as in Marx's famous phrase where he describes the working class as potentially the gravediggers of capitalism. But this potential threat isn't something that our rulers are unaware of. The critical role that oppression plays under capitalism is as a divide and conquer mechanism that makes it difficult for workers to see their common interests, whatever their gender, their race, religion, sexual preference, etc. In the case of racism, we have a phenomenon which grew up with capitalism itself. The foundations of North American capitalism were based on two horrific historical episodes: the stealing of land and resources from indigenous people, which obviously, as we heard in the last session and we know, continues to this day, and the institution of slavery, which was initially begun with poor whites and Aboriginal people as the plantation slaves in the U.S., which forcibly wrenched millions of black Africans from their homes to be sold into slavery in the New World. The foundations of successful U.S. capitalism, so the U.S. was able to build itself into the wealthiest capitalist nation in the world. This was literally built on the backs of African men, women, and children, and the immense suffering and misery this entailed, as was so convincingly portrayed in a movie that came out a couple of years ago, Steve McQueen's film, 12 Years a Slave. It was no exaggeration when Marx described the birth pangs of capitalism and colonialism in this way. He said, Capital comes into the world dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. Before the rise of capitalist society based on colonialism and the often violent expropriation of resources from those who lived in the colonies, modern-day racism as we know it didn't exist. In pre-capitalist societies, there was prejudice against strangers or those who lived in the next town, but there was no systematic categorization of different races as inferior. This understanding was something that Marx wrote about very compellingly in Capital Volume 1, and he says, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of the continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins are all things that characterize the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production." So in one sentence, Marx encapsulates immense amounts of human suffering, from the genocide visited on indigenous and First Nations people in North America to the slave trade, which saw blacks forcibly removed from their homes, to die on slave ships, or to survive only to become the property of white masters. The ideology of racism was necessary to capitalism because it was the bedrock and the justification for treating blacks and other colonized peoples as less than human. If they were not truly human, then slavery was justifiable in capitalist terms. So slavery in its most overt forms may have ended, but racism and colonialism are still very much with us in the 21st century. I think John Bell mentioned in the last meeting, no matter that Justin Trudeau claimed a few days ago in a speech in Pittsburgh that Canada has no colonialist baggage. It's hard to say how we could claim this with a straight face, looking at the recent occupations of INAC offices, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, across the country, that were bringing to light the horrific conditions for Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous youth, which are a direct result of Canadian colonialism. But racism is a double-edged sword. Its first target is obviously those who suffer most directly from prejudice and hatred. However, racism has another objective, which is to bind those who share the same skin color or religion or national affiliation to their own ruling class. Marx understood that this false consciousness or affiliation with one's own ruling class could only divide the 99% and make it much more difficult for ordinary people to make any gains. And in the following passage, he explains how English and Irish were set against each other in the 19th century and how this only benefited the bosses and the English ruling class. And if people were here last night at the meeting on the Irish Rebellion of 1916, it's very clear that even though the Irish were white, they were often called the Black Irish, and that basically that antagonism between English and Irish functions the same way that racism functions. And so Marx says, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude toward him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It's the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. Likewise, women's oppression, although it predates capitalism and arose with the division of society into classes many thousands of years ago, plays a critical economic role for the system today. The ideology of sexism explains and justifies women's lower wages, since their primary role is still seen as that of wife and mother, regardless of what the reality might actually be. The institutionalization of the atomized nuclear family with mother at the center allows bosses to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the social conditions in which families are expected to survive. And when you look at the current situation with austerity in country after country, which includes attacks on the necessary supports for families, things like accessible health care, decent and affordable daycare, humane elder care, individual family members, and particularly women, are expected to, and often they feel humanly obliged to, step in and fill that ever-increasing gap. So that's why it's not surprising that some feminist writers in the 1970s wrote about the possibility of demanding wages for housework, since all the unpaid labor that women do in the home is critical to the ability of the working class to reproduce and replenish itself, and therefore it's critical in terms of its benefit to the ruling class in their pursuit of profits. But human beings haven't always lived in the family that right-wing politicians tell us is the natural way for human beings to be. In fact, for most of human history, people lived in tribes or clans, and there was no conception of individual children belonging to one heterosexual couple. In Creek-class societies, the tribe or the clan survived by sharing work and resources equally among all members. In many of these societies, there was a division of labor, which was partially based on the fact that it was more difficult for women to participate in hunting, which is a nomadic activity, due to pregnancy and childbirth. In general, in those societies, although it's not a rule, there are societies that function differently, but in general, men tended to be the hunters and women the gatherers, but this division of labor didn't imply inequality or that one activity was more highly prized than the other. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the anthropological research, it was women who collected usually about 2/3 of the foodstuffs in most clans, and many Creek-class societies were matrilineal. It's only when you get the division of society into classes, when the nomadic societies transition to sedentary farming communities, that for the first time, human beings are able to produce more than is needed for basic survival. So with the creation of surplus for the first time, you get the creation of a ruling class, where those who control the surplus can accumulate wealth at the expense of the vast majority in society. Sorry. So for historical reasons that we can go into in discussion, it tended to be men who gained control of this surplus, albeit obviously a tiny minority of men. It became important to be able to trace lineage through the father for inheritance of this wealth. Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's longtime friend and political collaborator, described this period of the rise of class society as the world historic defeat of the female sex. For a while during the industrial revolution of the 19th century, it seemed to Marx and Engels as if the working class family might cease to exist, as all members of the family, men, women, and children, were being pulled into the factories and the mines to make profits for the capitalists. But through a combination of far-seeing capitalists who realized that they were killing the goose that laid the golden egg by basically driving working class families into extinction, and the efforts of workers themselves, who fought against women and children being forced into unsafe working conditions, where no kind of home life was possible, they managed to gain some protections for women and children and men in terms of their work lives. But this was a gift with a kind of poison pill in the center, because it meant the establishment as the norm of the nuclear family. So men worked outside the home for a so-called living wage, and women were supposed to stay at home and provide the heart in a heartless world, bringing up the next generation of workers. Now, of course, for most working class people, that ideal was never a reality. The majority of working class women had to work outside the home for lower wages and in worse jobs than men, and they were also seen as being primarily responsible for running the household and looking after children. And capitalism has continued to perpetuate the ideology of this ideal family, however much it no longer represents a lot of people's lived experience, because it means that families, and women in particular, bear the burden of providing the necessary labor to produce the next generation of workers that the system needs to survive. This includes also providing for and caring for those who can no longer work and therefore are no longer valuable in terms of the way capitalism looks at people. People with severe disabilities, the elderly, people with mental illness, with little or no support from crumbling and underfunded social support systems. The nuclear family, as it has been shaped by capitalism, can be a prison that rigidly prescribes gender roles and gender itself, functions as a hierarchy, and bears the unrealizable, the unattainable goal of providing a humane haven from the pressures of capitalism in crisis. So what's the relationship between class and oppression? According to Marx, the working class is a class in itself. That is, capitalism creates this class of people who objectively have no way to survive other than by selling our labor power. So it's in our objective interest as a class of people who have nothing to sell but our ability to labor, to band together and organize society differently so that all wealth and power aren't monopolized in the hands of a few. But what needs to happen, says Marx, is that the working class needs to become a class for itself. That is, a class that understands its power and the need to organize collectively to overturn the bloody system that exploits and oppresses us all. This can never happen when we are divided from each other along gender, racial, national, religious lines, or when we allow ourselves to be so divided. When Russian revolutionary Lenin described revolutions as festivals of the oppressed, he was speaking to the reality of the liberating power of struggle. Just as the Russian Revolution was ignited by groups of working women who were demanding bread, so revolutionary situations since Lenin's time have all included powerful currents struggling against various kinds of oppression. Lenin also argued that the working class movement had to be a tribune of the oppressed. A working class that accepts racist, sexist, or homophobic ideas will not be able to achieve its own liberation, because it is these poisonous ideas that the ruling class will use to divide and conquer. And I think in the contemporary context, we can see how notions such as reverse racism or men's rights serve to trivialize the real historic and continuing oppression of blacks, indigenous people, and other racial minorities, and the oppression of women, which is manifested in lower wages, sexist imagery in popular culture and advertising, violence, and rape. And it's no surprise that the people pushing these ideas of reverse racism or the need for men's rights often hold extremely reactionary views on the place of women, blacks, and other minorities in society. And I think these reactionary ideas can be the downfall, obviously the downfall of the groups that are targeted by those ideas, but they can also be the downfall of the whole working class if workers buy into these attempts to blame those who are oppressed for their own bad lot under capitalism. And I think if you look at the US right now, the politics of Donald Trump are a good example of what we mean when we talk about politics that divide and conquer. Fighting against oppression is something that needs to be taken up by all of us, whether we're talking about women and men fighting and opposing sexism, about blacks and whites fighting racism in movements such as Black Lives Matter, or indigenous and non-indigenous activists uniting to stop pipelines, or as recently Crystal was talking about, to highlight the completely avoidable tragedy of mass suicide in communities like Atahualpa. I think the kind of anger and hope that we see, for example, in the young women of Black Lives Matter who organized the 2-week occupation in front of police headquarters at College Unjieng in Toronto, were the Indigenous activists who occupied INAC offices in Toronto and other cities across the country. It's possible for those kind of actions to come